Thank you very much for inviting me to speak. This is quite an honor, and I'm really happy to be here to be able to share with you some of the findings that I discovered as I was researching this very shrouded country. Saudi Arabia is in the news a lot, and it's not a place where information is hard to find, but more a place where information is hard to understand. So what I undertook for this research paper was to try to understand the information that was being put out by the government and also by the press and the media and other researchers. So I'm going to start a little bit with some of the background of Saudi Arabia so you can understand a little bit about what it is. And then I'm going to talk to you about how I did the geopolitical analysis of the entire environment in Saudi Arabia. When you talk about economic freedom, you can't really talk about that without sort of tangentially discussing political freedom. So this is going to be a little bit about the politics and the economics and the impact that the mutually reinforcing impact that they have on each other. So first, my research was primarily built around one document or report, and that was the Economic Freedom of the World report, which basically found that Saudi Arabia's economic system is moderately free, and it offers, it gets respectable marks for trade and fiscal freedom. However, it cautions that the kingdom falls very well short in areas of government, property rights, and regulatory efficiency. So that said, when we look at the geopolitics of any country, you have to understand that economic statecraft is a tool that we use in the government, but also in business. And part of the government's role is to help businesses to be successful in other parts of the world. And in order to do that, they sort of have this symbiotic relationship whereby foreign policy has an impact on how we do business and how we sort of interact with foreign countries. So I'm going to take you through a little bit of geopolitical analysis so that you can understand, you can get a little bit of a contextual understanding of the environment of Saudi Arabia and sort of discover it the way that I did, a little bit at a time. So from my research, these are the key insights that I took away. That obviously the Saudi reform that's sort of happening right now with Vision 2030 is the most serious economic reform they've ever undertaken. And that's since the creation of the state in the 1930s. I also discovered that the social and cultural barriers to this economic reform that we're going to talk about today are extremely significant and will be very turbulent. We're starting to see that now in the news and in the press, and I think we're gonna discover that the driver of this social unrest are these political and economic freedoms that the population and that the people, the Saudis, really are sort of clamoring for. I learned that the succession struggle that everybody talks about and says is, a hallmark of economic freedom is interesting, but it's not going to devolve into open hostility, and that we probably won't see that being a driver of great unrest. And then the last piece, if we have time, is this giant question mark about Saudi Aramco, which is, it's the largest state-owned oil company in the world, but it's also tied to the identity of Saudi Arabia. So the IPO isn't just a business venture, and it isn't just an investment opportunity. It really has a lot to do with how Saudis view themselves and their position in the world, which again relates back to geoeconomic statecraft. So the first part of this is understanding that it's an absolute monarchy. That means something, because that means that the governing family, the royal family, makes all the decisions, right? And that means that it's not a representative government, and when there is less representation, there's less freedom. All right, sorry, I lost my page. So it's important to understand how this impacts the domestic security. So the first thing you have to understand is that the government, or the first thing I learned, is that the government is has such a strong hand over the people and they exercise that through two different, very important security elements. The first of which is the National Guard, which is sort of like the Ministry of Interior, but it's their Praetorian Guard. And that element really clamps down on anything that the administration or the government, the Saudi royal family, feels that causes any problem whatsoever to their, or any threats to their rule. Now, understanding this means that there isn't a lot of room for them to make different decisions or decisions that diverge or depart from what the family wants them to do. So when this happens, they crack down very quickly, and this means that social unrest that we saw in other places in the Arab Spring probably will not manifest very easily in Saudi Arabia. And if it does, or if they even sense that it's going to happen, it will be cracked down very harshly. So that's, in terms of domestic security, this is how this sort of impacts the level of economic freedom and political freedom. When they don't have the freedom to make choices that are different from what the regime thinks are important, then that sort of lessens the ability to operate independently. It squelches entrepreneurship and innovation, and this has an impact on how we do trade and investment, and how we relate as a government to the government of Saudi Arabia. So this is important. Terrorism is important to point out because this is where we diverge and where we have some issues with sort of like competing agendas, right? So we are firmly against, the government is firmly against the idea of state-supported terrorism, or the fact that they would be perceived as supporting terrorism by the state. So that means that they, in turn, have to create policies that crack down on these, perceptions of state-sponsored terrorism, which can be interpreted or misinterpreted as less economic and political freedom, when in fact the support to counterterrorism measures actually are, sort of measures that they take to increase the amount of interaction they have with Western countries like the United States. So, according to the State Department, in the past few years, the Saudi government has demonstrated a much greater resolve in countering this terrorism, not just by fighting it internally, but also by preventing it abroad. Now, this actually creates a greater amount of political or economic freedom, but at the same time, a lesser amount of political freedom, because people are not allowed to voice their opinions about how they feel and how this is being done. This complicates relations with the United States for obvious reasons, because that's one of our #1 priorities, and that manifests itself in our foreign policy and the way that we interact with, let's go back, and the way we interact with Saudi Arabia. So, over the last 3 years or so, we've had a number of flashpoints under the Obama administration. It looks like today things are well, they were on a path to improving. I don't know what's going to happen in the next couple of months, but this administration seemed to be much more open to reestablishing a good relationship that wasn't solely based on oil and counterterrorism. And this is kind of what comes into play when we talk about economic incentives and the Vision 2030. So right now, some of the things that are complicating this relationship include JASTA, which is the law that was just passed last year that allows victims of terrorism, like what happened in 9/11, to sue state governments like Saudi Arabia. Obviously, this complicates things, and this also limits the amount of economic and political freedom that they will exercise in Saudi Arabia with respect to how they relate to the United States. Is it an economic weapon? Some people would argue that it is. And, they have made some explicit threats to the United States that they will, curtail their investments in the U.S., especially in critical areas of, oil and gas infrastructure. They have also had many or few isolated cases of punishment for these so-called crimes. And right now, it's a buyer's market, given that the situation with oil and the oil prices and the oil shocks that manifested or starting in 2014 have really changed the game and the calculus for both the Saudis and for the U.S. government. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the economic insights that I discovered during my research. First, Saudi Vision 2030, which represents the most ambitious diversification program that Saudi Arabia has undertaken since its inception. It's designed to help them diversify the economy so that it's no longer reliant and solely dependent on the whims of oil prices, and it's to propel the kingdom into the 21st century. And it's actually largely modeled after the UAE, which was something I didn't know and isn't mentioned very often in the press. So I think that it's important, if you want to understand where it's going, to see where it's been or where it came from. What they're trying to do with this Vision 2030 is to create more economic freedom, to encourage investment in other parts of and other sectors of Saudi Arabia, to include infrastructure and solar energy and desalination and water projects and other things. And they also want to create the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world, which is a very ambitious goal. I'm not entirely sure they're going to be able to make it, but the fact that they're even trying means that they recognize that they need, in order to grow the economy, they need more investment and they need more diversification. So they understand it's not just about oil. As I mentioned, they currently have the largest desalination plant in the world, and they also have natural gas reserves that could power their entire country and then some. But they haven't been able to take advantage of these because they don't have the infrastructure and the technical skills in place. 2030 is designed to bring those in, and once that happens, that will actually increase the amount of economic freedom that the Saudis enjoy, and also the third country nationals that are helping them to develop will also enjoy. So as you can see, there are a significant number of challenges to the education system. They currently don't have a system in place. And there are a tremendous number of cybersecurity risks to these infrastructure projects, especially given that it's a target-rich environment and that they haven't really paid much attention, even despite Shamoon attacks and other things. They haven't paid much attention to their cyber hygiene. So this will be a target-rich environment for malign actors that are looking to sort of impede Saudi Arabia's economic growth. In addition to that, obviously, there's going to be some religious resistance because it is the home of Mecca and Medina, and that means that there is a significant religious overtone to any political or economic undertakings that they may try. So this is how we are looking at it. This is one of the first considerations that you have to think about when you're considering their economic diversity, and that is their population growth. And because they are growing, it's creating a consumption problem, and they don't have they don't have any plans in place to meet that increased demand. So this is why they're trying to figure out how they can leverage alternative energies to grow the economy, and it's a great start for them to in terms of thinking outside of their traditional windows and boxes. So this is my favorite, connecting Saudi Arabia. This is one of the great ideas that was introduced by the young prince, Mohammed bin Salman. He would like to finish the railroad system that they have. They have this great railroad system that ends like about 100 miles from the border. So it really goes to nowhere. And so literally, I mean, it starts in Riyadh and it goes all the way up to the border, and then it's like 100 miles short of the border. It just stops, and there's no like platforms or stations anywhere along the way. So this idea of connecting Saudi Arabia it's a railroad that he'd like to build that connects not only the cities inside of Saudi Arabia to one another, but also connects Saudi Arabia to the rest of the GCC. So this is probably one of the best I think ideas that they have in terms of economic diversification and growth, and it's one of the ways that they can become more economically inclusive. They can, there are 3 or 4 different tiers of education and skills that are required to make this a reality. So they are now, I'm sure you're probably already aware, there's a widespread smart device campaign, and as we saw in Arab Spring, almost everybody has a cell phone. Even people that don't have running water and bathrooms, outdoor bathrooms, or indoor bathrooms, have smart devices. So this is great because for economic freedom, because it allows the Saudis to connect to each other and to connect to people outside. However, it also is a threat to the Saudi government because it means that people can communicate and they don't get to control the narrative. So where this provides an opportunity for economic growth and diversification is, in the market competition for telecommunications, for mobile devices, for smartphones. So it's a double-edged sword, but right now the good technology and the investment is winning over the fear and the attempt to control the narrative. So this is sort of the economic climate. We know that they are burning through foreign reserves at an incredible rate as a result of the oil shocks that started in 2014. They've not been able to recover, and even though it is the lowest country in the world in terms of production costs, they are responsible for consumption. Like, they consume like almost 80% of what they bring up. So until they can figure out how to not do that, which is why the alternative energy is so important, this is going to remain a problem for them. Especially given that we don't foresee or forecast that oil is going to go above $60 a barrel anytime in the next couple of years, and that's a pretty generous estimate. I mean, we've been hovering below 50 for a while, and we're at 47 today. So labor issues, again, another part of economic freedom is how does the government treat their labor force and their workforce. They have a 12% unemployment rate, which isn't terrible. The problem is that the majority of the unemployed folks are the working age males, right? And as we all know from the other terrorism classes, those are the people that when they're unemployed, they get really frustrated and they start to do things we don't want them to do. They turn to nefarious activities and become very industrious, but they're not contributing to the economy. So this is an important issue that contributes to what we're going to talk about next, which are the social fault lines. Obviously, it's a very highly conservative culture, and religion plays a major part of not just the culture, but pretty much every part of their lives. It's the political, it's the economic, it's religious, it's all of it. They have very little freedom to express dissent. And when they do, they have to do it anonymously, which, as you know, isn't as forceful or as effective as when you're able to put a face with a voice. As I was mentioning before, they have this very large youth population, and because of the declining reserves that we mentioned on the last slide, they don't have as much access to wealth or privilege as they used to. And one of the ways that the royal family controls that is they just sort of whack off like the bottom tier on the line and block chart of crown princes and princesses. So they just, over the last 2 years, they've cut off like the last 2 entire lines of the line and block chart. So although we have also an increasing number of educated women, they do not have access to jobs because, 1, they always need a chaperone, and 2, it really is a lot of lip service given the religious overtones. That may be changing. It's hard to tell. We've seen some positive signs. I don't know if any of you have seen the funny video on YouTube of Saudi Arabian women that are playing basketball in burqas, but it's pretty cool. And so it's maybe suggestive of what's going to happen in the future, maybe not, but it looks like a ray of hope. Social stability, again, as I mentioned before, right now it's pretty stable, and that's because the population knows that if they step out of line or voice too much dissent, that they will be sort of brought back in. However, there are some rays of hope. In some of the social media scraping that that I've done, actually, that I've been able to find some bright spots where people are able to, voice their opinions anonymously, and subsequently, within a couple of months, changes start to take place. So it'll really depend on whether or not whether or not the government is able to keep doing this, or whether they will feel threatened by this. And my last slide is about technology and the growth of private industry. This is important because this is the key to the future, as it is in any emerging or developing economy. If they can embrace technology, they will be able to diversify, and if they can diversify, they will expand their economic and political freedom. If they can't, or if they feel threatened by technology and they start to try to reverse technological advances, that's when we'll see some of those problems that we talked about in the social situation. They are prioritizing some of these technology-related industries like pharma and the non-oil energies. They're looking at mining, and not just for petroleum. And they have developed, or they have, Saudi Aramco has funded a university called the KAUST, which focuses solely on technology and innovation and entrepreneurship. If they can, leverage these higher learning institutions and, really embrace the technological explosions, I think that the vision for success for economic freedom and for expanded political freedoms for Saudi Arabia will be quite bright.